Hello, and welcome to Brown University. Please take this opportunity to turn off all mobile devices for the duration of the event. All or portions of this event and its participants may be captured by photography or video and used for news or promotional purposes. Standing or sitting in the aisles is not permitted. Smoking is not permitted inside any building on Brown's campus. In the event of an emergency, please walk calmly and quickly to one of the marked exits and move away from the building. Thank you for your cooperation.
I felt like I needed to do the flight attendant thing to the marked exits. Welcome, everyone. My name is Leah Van Wy, and I'm the Dean of the Faculty here at Brown University, and I have the pleasure of introducing our speakers and welcoming you today. Thank you all for actually making it all the way across the green and not getting stuck in a football game along the way. So this discussion is part of our ongoing effort to engage all segments of our campus community in dialogue about two fundamental principles: academic freedom and freedom of expression, that are necessary both for meeting our university mission and for a robust democracy in our country. Our programming to date has involved lectures, seminars, panels, and discussions about these principles and about the ongoing debates about their relevance and relationships to other goals at Brown. And so, as you know, particularly during periods of intense national and global activism, we get frequent inquiries, questions, complaints from students, staff, and faculty about Brown's policies governing freedom of expression, including questions regarding standards for protest and demonstration, public statements, and free speech. At the very highest level, our policies reflect the fact that the protection of freedom of expression is absolutely essential for faculty, staff, students, and alumni with a broad range of viewpoints to come together to learn from each other and to deepen their understanding of the incredibly complex issues at the heart of every aspect of modern society. And so we're really honored today to have Nadine Strossen here to talk to us about to discuss with us these very issues. So Nadine is the John Marshall Harlan II Professor of Law Emerita at New York Law School and the past president of the American Civil Liberties Union. And she's currently a senior fellow with FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. And she's a leading expert and frequent commentator on constitutional law and civil liberties, who's also testified before Congress on multiple occasions, something we hope none of the rest of us have to replicate here. So Nadine serves on the advisory boards of the ACLU, Academic Freedom Alliance, Heterodox Academy, and the National Coalition Against Censorship. The National Law Journal has named Strossen one of America's 100 most influential lawyers, and other national publications have named her one of the country's most influential women. And in 2023, the National Coalition Against Censorship selected Strossen for its Lifetime Achievement Award for free speech. Nadine is the author of several books and documentaries. She's the author of Hate, Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship, and Free Speech, What Everyone Needs to Know. And she's also the host and project consultant for Free to Speak, a 3-hour documentary film series distributed on public television just last year in 2023. And her book, Defending Pornography, Free Speech, Sex, and the Fight for Women's Rights, was named a New York Times notable book back in 1995. So she's been talking about this for quite some time. And tonight's conversation is going to be moderated by Frank Doyle, who's the provost at Brown University. So he is both a professor of engineering and the 14th provost of Brown. As the university's chief academic officer and chief budget officer, Frank works closely with the president to advance the university's mission of teaching, research, and service. And prior to this role, Doyle served as the dean of some other schools, John A. Paulson School of Engineering and Applied Sciences, SEAS, and he was also the John A. and Elizabeth S. Armstrong Professor, and as dean down the road, he established SEAS as the connective tissue of Harvard University, developing numerous joint programs with other Harvard schools, including new joint master's degrees, executive education, and a new PhD program. Almost done with the honors. Among a long list of distinctions, Doyle is a member of both the National Academy of Engineering and the National Academy of Medicine. He earned his bachelor's degree from Princeton, a certificate in postgraduate studies from Cambridge, and a PhD in chemical engineering from Caltech. So please join me in welcoming Frank and Nadine for this conversation.
Thank you, Leah, for that very warm welcome. And Nadine, welcome back.
I'm
to
delighted
Brown.
to be back here. If I may say, I'm so honored that the president of the university is gracing us with her presence and resisting playing Frisbee and other pursuits. And the immediate predecessor of your current distinguished president, Chris Paxson, is somebody who has long been a free speech hero of mine. So I have that wonderful association with Brown University. If I may, when Ruth Simmons became president here, I believe in the year 2000, she was the first African-American president of any Ivy League university and the first female president of Brown. There were already some free speech controversies at Brown, and in her very first commencement or convocation address, she made a statement which was so eloquent in light of pressures that have accelerated since then. And I quoted it in my book on hate speech, but the words are actually imprinted in my mind. She said, addressing the students who are out there right now frisking about in your wonderful green spaces, she said, education at its best is the antithesis of comfort. The antithesis of comfort. So if any of you have come here seeking comfort, go through yon iron gates. But if any of you have come here seeking to bring about change in your community, then you owe it to yourselves to subject yourself to the discomfort that good education brings.
Nadine, thank you. And thank you for acknowledging the competition we have with Mother Nature outside. You've been here before, so I can't tell you it's like this every day. You know better than that. But as you said earlier, and I can share with the audience, I hope, it's not about the quantity, it's the quality. So we're pleased to have all of you here today for this conversation. So I thought I would start off. I can't help but think about the fact that we've got the privilege of a lawyer here with us today who has quite literally written the book on both hate speech and academic freedom. And I should note, the book on hate speech meaning how to deal with this and not censorship, but academic freedom. So in that context, thinking about your legal perspective, can we start off with a legal definition of hate speech? Could you offer that for us?
No, we cannot, Frank, because it is not a legally recognized concept, precisely because the Supreme Court has consistently refused to recognize a category of speech that is defined by its hateful content and said, therefore, it is not constitutionally protected. To the contrary, the Supreme Court has repeatedly, consistently, and essentially unanimously said that the answer to speech whose idea we hate is not to suppress it, but to answer it, to refute it, to use other strategies to try to counter its message. And by the way, one effective strategy might well be to ignore it. Paradoxically, people who seek to suppress a hateful message, which is certainly my goal as well, unwittingly often amplify the message by engaging in deplatforming or disruptive protest tactics. I understand that you recently had the Anti-Defamation League leader speaking here, and congratulations. I understand that there was a peaceful, non-disruptive protest. That's perfect. The Anti-Defamation League is an expert in responding to hateful ideas. The same is true for the Southern Poverty Law Center. And a few years ago, those two expert organizations put out a series of guidances for college students because there was a concerted campaign by some white supremacists to visit college campuses and try to stir up trouble. And the main advice that these two expert organizations, ADL and SPLC, had was to the students who were opposing the hate mongers, we understand that you will feel very tempted to engage in deplatforming tactics and disruptive protests, and that may feel very morally satisfying to you, but please beware that you are playing into the strategy of these groups. They are seeking the attention that is generated by protests. So the best thing you can do is to ignore them.
Providing oxygen
Yes.
is not the right strategy. Absolutely agree. You used a turn of the phrase earlier, which I think the version I remember anyway, for the thought that we hate, can be attributed to Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes back in the 20s. Help us wrestle with the idea of why we should be defending freedom for those who have these thoughts that we hate.
Absolutely, and let me share a personal story so you understand how deeply ingrained in my own experience is complete contempt for hateful and discriminatory ideas and a painful awareness of the unspeakable horrors that such ideas can inflict. My father is a Holocaust survivor who was born in Germany in 1922, and I'm very proud that my father, as a teenager, was active in anti-Hitler political movements. For that reason, and also for the reason that his mother was Jewish, as a teenager, he was imprisoned in the Buchenwald forced labor camp, where he almost died through the brutal conditions there. The Germans had a strategy, the Nazis had a strategy of literally working people to death. The motto was Zerstörung durch Arbeit, and forgive my horrible German accent, my father never wanted me to learn German, for reasons you can understand, but to destroy through work. And so just absolutely backbreaking labor in horrific conditions with malnutrition and starvation and disease. On top of that, they had a program of eugenocide, in addition to genocide, to make it impossible for undesirables to reproduce. My father being doubly undesirable as a political opponent as well as a half-Jew, literally had an appointment to be sterilized. And one day before that appointment, Buchenwald was liberated by American armed forces. So I could not have more hatred and contempt for the Nazis. And people will often ask me, you know, isn't it hard for you as the daughter of a Holocaust survivor to defend freedom of speech for Nazis, as my organization, the ACLU, famously or infamously, depending on your perspective, did in the late 1970s when we defended free speech for Nazis, neo-Nazis to demonstrate in Skokie. And I have to tell you, Frank, it is not hard for me at all, because I am I remain, because my mind is open-minded, but so far, based on the evidence I've examined and the reflections in which I've engaged, I remain convinced that it is especially important for members of any minority group, including ethnic and religious and political and racial and other minority groups. By definition, we're never going to have access to the majoritarian levers of power. So we especially depend on robust freedom of speech that is robust enough to extend to hate speech, because such a subjective term is predictably going to be disproportionately used against our speech. And if I can give one concrete example, I mentioned the famous ACLU case in the late 1970s, when, despite the fact that Nazi propaganda is absolutely antithetical to our own civil libertarian principles, we understood that to be able to advocate against Nazism and for civil rights and civil liberties, we had to defend the principle that government may not punish speech solely because it is deemed to be hateful or hated in a particular community. And an example that we cited in our brief, Frank, came from another city in Illinois, not too far from Skokie. Now, Skokie had a large population of Jewish people, many of whom were Holocaust survivors. But not too far away, in Cicero, Illinois, with a very different demographic, we had to defend the very same principles for a very different message that was deemed by the people of Cicero to be hateful, subversive, dangerous speech. And let me say this, that Cicero, Illinois was described by Time magazine as Selma, Alabama without the Southern accent. And so guess whose speech was deemed to be dangerous, subversive, and hateful in Cicero 10 years before the Skokie case? Martin Luther King and pro-civil rights demonstrators.
Shocking. Well, I don't want to continue the Nazi theme per se, but it's interesting, the subterfuge, the strategy inside, through your German, differed so strongly from the propaganda. You probably know this one. 40 years ago, I had the opportunity to visit Dachau, and I can remember on the gate, Durch Arbeit macht frei, through labor makes freedom. And just antithetical, it's amazing. Thinking about First Amendment rights, free speech, and hate speech, there are those who would say the First Amendment protects hate speech. There are those who would say First Amendment does not allow for hate speech. Where in that spectrum, if not on one of the poles, should we be landing?
As we were joking beforehand, it depends on the context. And I know those are infamous words now, but as a technical legal matter, it really is true. And if I can put on my law professor hat very briefly, all of First Amendment law, for all of its complexity, really boils down to two very common sense principles, one of which allows the government to restrict the speech, including the hate speech, that is the most dangerous. The other of which bars the government from engaging in the censorship that is the most dangerous. So what is the censorship that is the most dangerous? It is what would have occurred in Skokie if the ACLU had not won that case, unanimously in the Supreme Court, but who's counting? And seriously, the Supreme Court has said the bedrock principle underlying our whole complex system of free speech law is this viewpoint neutrality or content neutrality. The government may never punish or restrict speech solely because of dislike of, even loathing of the viewpoint, the idea, the content, or the message. But when one gets beyond the content of the speech and looks at it in its overall context, the court has crafted something that's often called the emergency principle, when in the circumstances the speech directly causes or imminently threatens certain specific serious harm, then the speech can and should be punished. And there are, I can give you two examples from the very same factual situation, Frank, both involving the same hateful content or viewpoint, one of which could not be punished and the other of which could. And they come from Charlottesville in 2017 when, by the way, the ACLU again came to the defense of the viewpoint neutrality principle, where the immediate beneficiaries were the Unite the Right demonstrators in that case. So these demonstrators, you may remember, are marching, chanting, and I get chills every time I repeat it or think about it, "You will not replace us. Jews will not replace us." And you can imagine how horrific that message is to me personally and hopefully to every decent human being. And yet we now know that the mere fact that it is a hateful, hated message is not enough to justify punishing it, and that's exactly what the court ruled, because there was no evidence. The chief of police from Charlottesville testified, we've got the situation under control. There are no plans for violence, and even if there were plans for violence, we're so well prepared, we'll counteract that. Tragically, that turned out not to be the case. But anyway, on the night before the scheduled march, you may recall there were a group of counter-protesters that were ringed around the statue of Thomas Jefferson in the middle of campus at the University of Virginia. And not only were the Unite the Right demonstrators chanting those odious racist slogans, they were also doing so while marching en masse at menacingly close distance to the counter-protesters, brandishing lighted tiki torches. At that point, considered in that context, the expressive conduct satisfied the emergency principle. The Supreme Court has recognized several subcategories, one of which is called a true threat, to distinguish it from the looser way we use the word threat in everyday speech. When the speaker is directly addressing a particular individual or small group of individuals and intends to instill a reasonable fear on the part of the targeted person that they will be subject to attack. And interestingly enough, the speaker does not have to intend to actually carry out the violence or the attack, because the harm is done if you reasonably, objectively believe that you're going to be subject to attack. That results in your self-censorship, and it deters your freedom of movement.
So some kind of clear and present danger, right?
Yes.
Violence you spoke of. So these are the things. That's the railing. Yeah.
Exactly.
So I want to ask you about another term of art, and that is something I've read in some of your work about, and that's the idea of counter speech, right? As a non-specialist, more speech is part of that. But help us define that term, understand that term, maybe a couple examples of what counter speech is.
Yes, and this goes back to the very first Supreme Court opinion that clearly laid out the emergency principle. It happened to be in an opinion by Justice Louis Brandeis, who wrote it essentially as a dissent, and 50 years later, in 1969, it was unanimously endorsed by the entire Supreme Court. And what he said was, the answer to evil counsels is good ones. But there are several misconceptions about the idea of counter speech, Frank, so I'm so glad you're giving me an opportunity to explain that it's a very fluid concept. It basically means anything we do exercising our own freedom of speech to counter the hateful idea, the hateful message. And what that consists of can vary enormously depending on the particular circumstances and your particular goal. So somewhat paradoxically, as I alluded to earlier, perhaps the most effective form of counter speech is silence. Walk away, to deny the oxygen. Another very important and unfortunate misconception about counter speech that I really want to preempt is it is not the responsibility of members of a targeted group that is subject to hate speech.
I was going to ask you, it feels like an unfair burden to subject
exactly.
them to.
And I don't know anybody who contends that it should be the burden of either the individual who's targeted or members of whatever the group is that is targeted. It is, in my view, the civic responsibility and human rights responsibility and free speech responsibility, not legally enforced by the government, to be sure, but I consider it a moral and civic responsibility to constantly, affirmatively, proactively celebrate the pro-human rights values, and, not just wait to defensively respond to some hateful attack. That said, it is also true that many leaders of minority organizations and prominent individuals, including Barack Obama when he was president, would often encourage students and others who had not yet attained such positions of political power about what an empowering experience it is to respond yourself. You have no duty to do that, but that it can be a very positive experience, including the experience of ignoring and walking away. Basically, you are conveying to the person who is trying to undermine your sense of self-respect and your sense of confidence, you can't do that to me. I have my own sense of dignity, and I look down on you for having such benighted ideas. I don't feel less, well, positively about myself. A couple of years ago, there was, to me, an excellent book, but it was a bestseller, so I guess a lot of people thought it was an excellent book, co-authored by Greg Lukianoff, a lawyer who is the CEO of FIRE, which we've already referred to, a free speech organization, and Jonathan Haidt, a very prominent social psychologist and expert on mental health, called The Coddling of the American Mind. And they argued against shielding students from hurtful, insulting speech, not at all because they minimize the potentially adverse impact of that speech, but purely from the, and not only because of free speech principles, but also as what we lawyers would call an independently sufficient reason for not shielding students from that kind of expression, is that you are doing so because you're hoping to benefit the psyche and the emotional and the psychological and the mental health well-being of that student, but unintendedly, you're actually doing more harm than good, because for a number of reasons, including the fact that in the actual world, unfortunately, we are all going to be subject to speech and ideas and expression that is deeply insulting and traumatizing. And so it is helpful for us to be prepared to develop the resilience and the cognitive skills that will enable us not to be undermined by that kind of expression. And they even advocated that all college students should be required to be trained in cognitive behavior therapy techniques.
Fascinating. You know, as you were talking about President Obama, exactly as you were speaking, I was evoking a memory of what Michelle Obama said along these lines of, when they go low, we go high, right? And that's another way to think about counter speech and the power there. You invoked a principle earlier that the Supreme Court was speaking about, viewpoint neutrality. And as you know, a lot of campuses, including your alma mater, are grappling with this notion of adopting a neutrality principle, a position of institutional neutrality. Chicago famously did this. Now Harvard's looking at this. Many of us are all wrestling with this. Do you think there's lessons that we can learn from how the courts have approached this to how we practice that in the universities?
That's a really interesting comparison. So first of all, I want to say that I'm not aware of, I certainly would not say that universities, even public universities, have a First Amendment duty to adopt principles of institutional neutrality. And this is kind of inside baseball talk. So let me explain to the audience that what Frank is referring to is the famous Chicago example, which was adopted in 1967, the so-called Calvin principles, where the university itself and the president and the provost and other top leaders of the university make a commitment that they will not issue any statements, any declarations with respect to any social, political, cultural issue. They will only address issues in that sphere that directly affect the university itself. So, for example, the state of Texas, there recently was a proposed legislation that would eliminate tenure for faculty members. That would be something that would directly affect the university's own mission.
Right.
And certainly, university presidents and other leaders should address that. But with respect to even the most important, urgent, political, international, social issues where members of your campus community feel very strongly, those are precisely the issues that the university as an institution should remain neutral to, not at all out of indifference, not at all out of insensitivity, but precisely to maximize the actual opportunity of every individual member of the campus community to opine vigorously and variously. Because the thought was, the rationale is that if somebody powerful and respected, such as President Paxton or the distinguished provost, opines on an issue, that it becomes much more difficult for a student or for an untenured faculty member, even a tenured faculty member, you still have power over us too, to freely express their views. So it's with a view toward maximizing academic freedom for members of the university community. I would also have to say, as a practical matter, it would be such a conservation of the extremely precious resource of the time and attention of these university leaders when we see how much time is drained in trying, I think, the thankless task of trying to satisfy various constituencies. The very last line in the Calvin Committee report was that by adopting this institutional neutrality approach, the university is maximizing what its special, unique mission is as a truth-seeking institution, and that is far more important than being a second-rate politician.
Fantastic. So I should have mentioned this when we first started talking, that we're really thrilled to bring legal expertise onto the campus to help us. We don't have a law school here, as you may know. And so as we try to navigate this terrain, we've often sought outside experts who bring a legal expertise that we don't have organically on the campus here. So we had another speaker a few weeks back, Sherilyn Eiffel, who you may know.
She was a student of mine when I began my teaching career as the director of the Civil Rights Clinic at NYU Law School, and she was phenomenal even as a law student.
She was phenomenal in her speech here, and I know President Paxton, myself, a few others were really captivated with an expression she used. She gave the Martin Luther King Jr. lecture here. And she talked about universities as the place to hold disagreement, the idea that we should protect this space for those contrary viewpoints, those opposing viewpoints to take place. How do you respond? I realize that you have this wonderful connection to her, but
people have used the term safe spaces in a way that I think is completely diametrically the opposite.
Agreed.
But to me, a university should be and must be and has a unique opportunity and therefore responsibility to be a safe space for dispute and disagreement. I fully agree with the Woodward report that was done at Yale in the 1960s, which basically said that the function of a university is to question the unquestionable and to debate the undebatable.
Absolutely. So you touched on this a little bit earlier, but I want to try to dig in a little deeper on this. So do universities have an obligation to bring controversial speakers in? Kind of building on this point we just talked about, why should we give a platform to somebody with potentially hateful, by at least let's say commonly understood principles, maybe not clear and present danger, but hateful perspectives? Do we have a responsibility to do that?
Excellent question, Frank. And I have to answer a subsidiary question first, which is that private universities such as Brown have no First Amendment responsibilities whatsoever. So let's be very clear about that. But the vast majority, so for people who are not familiar with this principle, the First Amendment, along with most of the Constitution, directly binds only government entities such as public universities. But Brown, along with the vast majority of excellent private universities, has voluntarily chosen to adhere to the same kinds of free speech principles that you would be legally required to adhere to were you a state university. And you have no First Amendment or free speech responsibility to invite any speaker at all. It is a great privilege and honor to be selected to be a speaker here, but I could not sue you if you had not chosen to invite me. To the contrary, being afforded a platform at a university is a very selective process, and it is appropriate to take into account the content and the viewpoint and the message in a way that government would not be allowed to discriminate against somebody's or Brown, for that matter, would not be allowed to discriminate against students who are speaking out on your green space there. They could voice whatever viewpoint they want. But when you choose to invite somebody to give a commencement address or to be part of a speaker series, you are going to be selective. Now, that said, there may well be legitimate, important, pedagogical, and educational reasons to bring a controversial speaker to campus. I remember many years ago, I was already ACLU president. There was a person named David Duke, who was a leader of the Ku Klux Klan, who was actually elected to office in Louisiana, and he was running a campaign for president. And there was a debate at a college in Colorado where the students were holding a forum about hate speech, and they invited somebody from a civil rights organization and somebody from the ACLU, and they invited David Duke. And that led to this huge firestorm of controversy. And I was brought out to defend their decision. Not that they had an obligation to do it, but given that this was a person who had political power, whose message, for better or worse, his message had traction among a significant segment of the public, I thought it was incredibly important for the students to hear his ideas and, more importantly, to have the opportunity to ask him questions, tough questions, and to raise counter-arguments to his ideas.
So building on that and thinking about your role as a fellow academic, as we anticipate programming of bringing in speakers who might, with good anticipation, have hateful content in their commentaries, their lectures, what are our responsibilities? What actions would you advocate we take to protect students that we know inevitably will be subject to mental distress, mental harm, mental health issues, potentially feeling discriminated against? If we don't cross lines of, say, severe and perseverant, if we don't cross lines of clear and present danger, what are the other sort of protective mechanisms that we should feel obligated in the university to offer?
I keep hearing Ruth Simmons about this is an essential element of education, and that it is an education not only to thrive in a university community, but to thrive in a pluralistic democracy where we want you to have the self-confidence and the mental and educational and professional resources to be able not only not to suffer distress, but also to be able to counter those ideas in an effective way. And I say all of this, Frank, with the greatest empathy. I really mean empathy for how very, very painful expression can be. And I personally have had that experience when I decided to run for the ACLU presidency. I knew that I would be subject to a lot of hateful speech and that it would be very difficult to deal with. And I did consult with mental health experts, counselors who gave me exercises and techniques and practice sessions. And I really, because I used to be very thin-skinned, and that is not a good way to approach such a position, a controversial position at the head of a controversial organization. And believe me, I'm not going to even quote some of the hate speech that I was subjected to, but one expression, I don't know if other people have heard it, many people who disparage the ACLU and various ethnic and religious minorities use the ugly racist epithet against us and call us blank loving, I'm not even going to use the euphemism, blank loving members of the ACLU. And you know, the first time I heard that, it really was devastating, to the point of, my husband finds this hard to believe, the point of silencing me. And I say that, you know, because seriously, that's the problem, the double-edged sword of speech. Everything that we say can have a chilling impact on what other people say. And that's a very powerful argument for suppressing hateful speech. It carries a lot of weight with me. But ultimately, I believe that we are never going to be able to censor our way out of hateful ideas or hateful actions, and that we have to develop the cognitive abilities and the psychological strength and the articulateness and access to technology that will enable us to counter with ideas rather than suppression.
Yeah, it sounded like a combination of training and experience in your case that got you to a good place. And so I look out in the audience at our faculty who are here, and I think about the attendant responsibilities that I hope you all embrace, that for our students, not only modeling behavior, but giving classroom opportunities for students to have those challenging conversations. I think that's a part of the training that's incumbent on us. So I'm going to ask one last question, then we're going to open it up. There are mics in the aisleway there, so folks who are thinking about a question, get ready to come up, and you can pose a question to Nadine here. Last question I have is, if you were to give the folks in the room here one piece of advice, something you'd like them to take away from our conversation, what would it be?
That if you are ever tempted, which I assume you will all be tempted, to argue for the suppression of a particular idea or expression that you find uniquely loathsome, I want to share with you an insight that one of my friends had about the Skokie case, where not only was that the Nazi speech horrifically hated and unpopular, that's an understatement, in Skokie, Illinois, but even among ACLU members, people who felt so strongly about strongly protecting free speech that they forked over their $20 to become card-carrying members, and that is an advertisement because it's still only $20. We lost 15% of our members. And one of my friends who was head of the National Coalition Against Censorship said, you know, Nadine, everyone has his or her Skokie. The one exception for the one message that we consider to be uniquely dangerous. And if you add up all of those just one exceptions, there's nothing left. And so the alternative to that is what I think of as the golden rule for free speech. If you want to have freedom for the speech that you love, then you must defend freedom for the speech that you loathe.
Yeah, fair point, fair point. Okay, we're going to open it up for folks in the audience here. If you have a question, come on up to the microphone. We have one on each side of the room. If you would introduce yourself, say who you are, what your background here, either at Brown or in the community is.
Hi, Nadine. I'm Tim Edgar. I'm a professor of the practice of computer science, and I also am affiliated with the Watson Institute. And I used to work for Nadine's organization for several years. I wonder if you could comment a little bit on the issue of the heckler's veto. This is an issue that comes up a lot in university contexts of speakers being shouted down. Why is that? How do you deal with people who say, well, that's my free speech, that's counter speech. You told me to counter speech, and now I'm doing it. And kind of related to that is the other sort of justification, if you will, for heckling, which might be, you're privileged, you're up there on the stage, we're all sitting here supposed to listen to you, and I'm trying to equalize it by bringing my counter speech. Can you talk a little bit about those?
This is another great example, Tim, of how common sense the free speech rules are. And another phrase that we lawyers often use is that there is a delicate balance. Yes, you may engage, and I would strongly, strongly defend your free speech right to engage in non-disruptive, peaceful protest. But when the protest becomes disruptive or violent, it not only is not an exercise of protected speech, it is violating the free speech rights of others, not only the speaker, but also audience members. And it's very important to understand that freedom of speech is not only the right of speakers to convey information and ideas, but also of audience members to hear the information and ideas. And the concept of heckler's veto, as Tim, you're a historian, so you know this, but that arose, as did so many of our core free speech principles, in the crucible of the civil rights movement, because censorship was the main tool that was used to try to suppress opposition to Jim Crow and advocacy of civil rights. And the justification that was given by many Southern officials for prohibiting Dr. King and other civil rights demonstrators from peacefully protesting was that there were hostile audience members, the occupants, the residents and local officials, and sadly sometimes law enforcement officials in these communities who were threatening violence and sometimes even engaging in violence, or at the very least shouting in such a way that the messages of the pro-civil rights demonstrators could not be heard. And the rationale that was given and upheld by a number of state Supreme Courts throughout the South was, well, we want to prevent violence, and so therefore we have to shut down these demonstrations because they're going to lead to violence from the counter demonstrators. And the Supreme Court adopted the term heckler's veto to overturn those decisions and to reject those arguments, that the response, the appropriate response on the part of government is to protect the speaker, to protect the voluntary audience members against the potential violence, against the disruptive protests. This is not a principle, as you say, Tim. It is so poorly known. Almost every week I read a situation, even at very prominent universities, where professors and security officials who should know better are saying, well, we can't stop these demonstrators who are shouting down the speakers because they're exercising their free speech rights. No, they're not. They're violating other people's free speech rights.
And I really appreciate your use of the term disruption, because as you well know, many universities, the language we use, in fact, the AAUP uses, is that you can't interfere with the normal business of the university.
Right.
And hearing somebody speak is part of the normal business. Having somebody give a lecture in a classroom, normal business. And You referenced an earlier speaker we had here this semester that you must have known something about what happened. There was a protest, but it didn't interfere with. They stood up, they silently walked out. That didn't interfere with the ability of the audience to have a meaningful interaction with
And
the
there
speaker.
are so many ways that one can very eloquently convey protest, in addition to walking out or turning your back or holding up a sign. I would defend the right of protesters to briefly boo or hiss or shout, as long as it's not at such a sustained and prolonged basis that it interferes with the effective delivery of the talk.
Completely agree. And the other part of the way the AAUP has framed this, which is implicit in what you're saying, is they talk about the rights of academic freedom, and they talk about the responsibilities that are attendant with that. And it's one of the few places I've seen it framed with those bookends, and it's really marvelous. Other questions from the audience? Looks like we have one coming here.
Hi, Professor Strossen. Thanks so much. My name is Eric Caldor. I work at the Sheridan Center for Teaching and Learning. And over the years, I've done a fair number of consultations with faculty members who, a few years ago, the concern was about cancel culture. Is something going to happen? And so what I'm interested in is how academic freedom is kind of being impacted by these various strains around freedom of speech. And one of the more recent consultations was actually a concern about lawsuits being brought against faculty members because someone in a class felt they were discriminated against or in some way impacted. And I don't know if you can speak to where the law stands on those kinds of issues. Where is the professor responsible for the dynamics of what's happening in their classroom? We're trying to encourage faculty to pursue difficult conversations, give them skills and training around that, but the legal questions are definitely not in our center, that's all.
Very interesting question. Thank you so much, and thank you for your really important work. Well, as a lawyer, I have to defend the right to bring a lawsuit, right? In all seriousness, there are some types, almost all states, to the best of my knowledge, do have laws, statutory laws against what they call lawsuits against political participation. I can't remember the exact acronym, but the idea is that we have to be sure that lawsuits are not brought on pretextual bases that are really not likely to succeed on the merits at all. Strategic lawsuits against public participation, where the purpose of the lawsuit is not really to win, because you can't really show that the professor is engaging in harassment or discrimination, I'm assuming, but that it can have an intimidating and silencing impact on not only that professor, but other professors, and for that matter, why not other students? I think, again, it comes back to education and for students to understand that being confronted with, or to use a less confrontational term, to be exposed to have the opportunity to grapple with ideas that they see as difficult and challenging, is the professor living up to her or his professional responsibility. I mean, just using my own experience as a law professor, but I believe this extends to every field, possibly less so in science and math, but certainly for social sciences or humanities. My mantra for my students, and I have a former student here who can attest to this, is that every student must be able to understand, articulate, and advocate every plausible perspective on every issue. You cannot practice law responsibly unless you can do that. But that is really what the essence of critical thinking and inquiry is. And it's our responsibility to prepare students for lives, as meaningful lives as engaged citizens, hopefully not only as members of the community, but as leaders of the community, by exposing them to ideas that they may find to be offensive, but they're not going to respond to it in the real world effectively by bringing a lawsuit. They're going to respond effectively by being able to understand and refute it.
I might point out that the Sheridan Center here has been a marvelous resource for us in doing pedagogical training and in offering workshops and sessions to help faculty acquire the skills to manage those kind of difficult conversations.
And I assume the university is very supportive if a professor is subject to that kind of lawsuit.
Absolutely.
The university has the professor's back.
Right. Looks like we have a question on this side.
Hi, Professor Strossen. Thank you so much for being with here and with us today. My name is Margot. I'm currently a sophomore here at Brown, and what struck me was the words that you used, opportunity to grapple with, and I definitely see it as an opportunity, but I know a lot of my peers find that the increasing tensions and polarization are not exactly conducive to encountering different viewpoints and being prepared for that critical engagement. And so I was wondering if you could speak to how the universities, especially ones like Brown, can encourage an environment where students are more perceptive to varying perspectives in this increasing age of polarization.
Thank you so much, Margot. And let me just first say that what you are describing is a universal problem across campuses in the United States. For the last 4 years, FIRE, together with College Pulse, has been doing very detailed surveys of campus climates on various universities and colleges. And this year, the last report came out in September. They ranked 248 campuses. Famously, we know that Harvard was number 248. Right. But, you know, in addition to looking at the policies that the universities followed and administrative actions that the university took, and whether there was any retaliation or threatened retaliation against faculty or students for making controversial statements, whether deplatforming, one of the constituent elements was a very detailed survey by students. And sadly, for all of the differences between numbers 1 and number 248 on all of the other vectors, the conclusion of that survey, of that report, was on the factor of whether students feel comfortable expressing views on certain sensitive topics. The difference between number 1 and number 248 was negligible. That even on campuses that have the best policies, the strongest pro-free speech administration, the greatest resources such as you have here for training, what is making students silent is fear of other students. And very sadly, this report showed that 50% of students on every campus surveyed say that they cannot have a frank and candid conversation, not only in class, but even with other students about a whole range of important issues. Issue number 1, where most students say they cannot have a frank and candid conversation, abortion. Think of how important that issue is now. Yep. And number 2, interestingly enough, was gun control and gun policy. Police practices, immigration, anything to do with race, anything to do with gender. So I hate to bounce the question back to you, but the solution for that problem is not going to come from people like me or any of us older folks. It's got to come from the peer culture itself, and their psychological surveys, the social psychological studies show that we humans are so subject to peer pressure. That's the bad news, but the good news is that all it really takes is one nonconformist, one person who dares to speak up can have an amazingly galvanizing impact making it much easier for others. And so I'm very encouraged by organic developments that I see coming from students on campuses. I was told that your campus is one of a number I've heard of where students have formed a debate union, for example, precisely to encourage at least a safe space on campus for debating controversial issues. Others campuses, students have started free speech groups or discussion across differences groups.
I might offer an additional perspective here. I've noticed sort of empirically this question of peer pressure, whether we think of the students or the faculty, frankly. I've noticed that in the context of scale, small groups are much more likely to invoke that dialogue, that exchange. But there seems to be a critical mass on size where suddenly one side feels like they can't speak out, they're self-censoring, they're not contributing. Is that something you've witnessed or seen?
I have seen it. And I think there are logical reasons for that, because maybe the smaller the group, the more you are able to develop individualized, holistic senses of the other person as an individual. You're not just lumping them into a category, bad or good, based on what they say on a particular issue, but you see them as a full-fledged person, and even if you disagree on one issue, you know that you agree on other issues, they're basically a good person. You can develop a sense of trust. And so I think that probably is a useful way to start. If I can mention one other technique, and I see a downside to it as well, but Harvard Law School implemented under the leadership of its former dean, who has become the new acting provost of Harvard University, very committed to academic freedom. And he implemented a policy of what are called Chatham House rules in the classroom, that what is said in the classroom stays in the classroom, very strong norms, and also practical steps, including the students have to put aside their cell phones so they can't, no recording of what's going on.
Fascinating. We've got another question over here.
Nadine, hello. I'm coming from Washington University as a second-year doctoral student, and it's a pleasure to be here on Brown's campus. And I think you might know where I'm going with this, Nadine, but I'm going to ask you the same question I asked you 4.5 years ago when you came to my school at WashU. And it's a kind of a long-winded question, so I have it pulled up here. But I was born in Kingston, Jamaica to a poor family and left at Maxfield Park Orphanage when I was just a few days old. And now I live in the US, and I've returned to Jamaica many times, and their motto is out of many, one people. Jamaicans are a mix of descendants of African slaves, Chinese, Spanish, and Europeans. There is no racial or religious discrimination. If someone is poor, what they say has less influence, and if one is rich, they are heard more, and what they say has more influence. There is obvious discrimination based on economic status. What is your take on this issue, and what can be done to give those who have lower economic status a stronger voice to be heard?
This is, if I can comment, this is Lexi Hansen, whom I first had the honor of meeting when she had just begun her undergraduate career, which has now been very successfully concluded at Washington University in St. Louis, where my book on hate speech had been chosen as the common read for all incoming students. And I requested, when I was asked to come out and deliver the convocation address for that reason at the opening of the new academic year, and I made my customary request that the presentation be in the form of an interview with a distinguished member leader of the campus. But I also had the idea that it would be nice if a few of the new students who had read the book, were being required to read the book, would also ask questions, and Lexi was one of those students who asked that question, and we've become friends and remained friends with her parents as well. So thank you. I think it's a really important issue, and I have to say that my views about free speech have become augmented, refined, enhanced as a result of all of my thinking. I haven't done a 180-degree change on any of my views of free speech, but I've come to have a more demanding standard that it is not enough just for, let me quote the words of the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. That legal protection is necessary but not sufficient to have meaningful free speech. And my mission is really to make sure we really do have robust free speech, including dealing with all of the issues that have been raised by these questions. And certainly that includes empowering everybody, regardless of who they are, regardless of their educational level, regardless of their access to economic resources or not. We really, as people who are committed to not only free speech, but to equality and democracy. I mean, the whole panoply of values of, liberty and justice for all, as the saying goes. We have to make sure that everybody has the technological and educational and psychological resources to be able to actually equally and robustly contribute to the community discussion.
Fantastic. Well, I imagine some minds are turning to maybe, oh, no, we have a run on the mic. This is great. Lots of questions percolating up here, please.
Yes, good afternoon, Professor. Thank you. I enjoyed your comments very much. I've heard 2 or 3 times now you mentioned the name of Harvard, and it strikes me that it must be doing pretty well, and one day maybe it'll be up on the level of Brown. I don't have any connection at all to Brown other than about 6 decades ago when I took the train out to New England. I stumbled up this hill and I thought it was pretty nice, and so they were careless enough that a year later they let me in. But my question is this, and I think it's a little sensitive, but in all these years, I've never been disappointed with the notion that I was lucky enough to get into an Ivy League school, much less this one, until a couple months ago. And it struck me that if Brown's president or its provost had found herself or himself before the congressional committee where Harvard's President Claudine Gay found herself, is it possible that the movers and shakers at Brown or Dartmouth or Cornell would have done what appears Harvard did in its treatment and abuse of President Claudine Gay?
Oh, so you think that she was unfairly treated, and I'm not an expert on that at all. In other words, I haven't looked at in depth at the plagiarism charges or the extent to which, and so if you have a particular reason for that conclusion, I would be happy to hear it. But obviously the reasons that were given had to do with the adverse, well, I guess the reason that was given officially was concern that she herself gave for stepping down. I read the letter of resignation, that she decided that her continued presence was having a negative impact on the university that she cherished. Which seems to me to be a very responsible position to take. Now, if the suggestion is that she was effectively forced out for pretextual reasons, that would be very disturbing, and there is an aspect of, so I can tell you what the principles are. I'm not an expert on the facts here. Academic freedom consists of not only the right of every individual member of the academic community to freely discuss and debate and inquire, as I referred to earlier when we were talking about the Calvin principles, but it's also a principle of institutional autonomy vis-a-vis the government. And I am very concerned, again, as a matter of principle, I'm not an expert on the particular facts here, but there is something quite ominous about Congress calling in presidents and other leaders of universities and subjecting them to interrogation and attempts at embarrassment, and also subpoenaing documents, as has happened now, and bringing lawsuits against the universities. Again, you know, as with everything, it is a matter of a delicate balance, and to the extent that Congress's inquiries are aimed at trying to protect and enhance academic freedom, that's good, but often something uses a very positive label to actually have the opposite impact. And the technique, as I hope students of history know, this was the technique that was used during the McCarthy period and Red Scares in our history to subject university professors and leaders to political interrogations and to demand turning over documents. So the devil is in the detail, and I think we have to be very vigilant that universities' autonomy in making decisions about their curriculum and making decisions about their academic freedom policies, the composition of their communities. These are the pillars of institutional autonomy that our elected officials, and this is a nonpartisan comment, it doesn't matter whether it's Republicans or Democrats, that there should be a certain independence from and autonomy from the political process. When Frank mentioned the AAUP, the American Association of University Professors, a very important organization that was founded in 1915, set out a declaration of academic freedom principles that is still the gold standard. The United States Supreme Court has essentially treated the AAUP principles as implicitly protected by the First Amendment. But the immediate impetus for the forming of the AAUP and the elucidation of those principles was to resist corporate pressure and government pressure against university autonomy and institutional academic freedom. So thank you for raising that concern.
Great, thank you. President Paxson.
You just said my name. I don't have to say it. I'm going to two questions, if you don't mind. One is Title VI. We do have a legal obligation to protect students from harassing, discriminatory behavior that crosses the line that makes them unable to fully access educational benefits. So I know it all depends on context in any one instance, but how do you think about where we draw that line? Second point is we may decide we can't suppress hateful speech, but we do like to cultivate a campus where people are respectful and kind. And can we do that in a way that doesn't verge into self-censorship?
Two great questions, President Paxson. Thank you so much. So Title VI of the Civil Rights Statute requires every university that receives federal funding, which is essentially every university, as a condition of eligibility for federal funding to respond promptly and effectively to complaints of and evidence of what's usually called hostile environment harassment. And the definition of hostile environment harassment, kind of consistent with what the term would suggest, is when there is a pattern of conduct, so it's usually not an isolated incident, a pattern of conduct, including expressive conduct, that is so severe and pervasive and objectively offensive that it violates or interferes with or undermines an equal educational opportunity. It's a tough standard, I think appropriately so. So in order to show such a pattern that is severe and pervasive and actually violates somebody's equal educational opportunities, there have to be a lot of facts to support that. I've read some of the complaints that have made that allegation. The Department of Education Office of Civil Rights has filed such a complaint against Harvard, against Columbia, a number of, I've read those 2 complaints, and both of them were like 88 pages long with literally hundreds of allegations. And even if those allegations were proven in a court of law, the university's obligation is that it may not be deliberately indifferent. So the university is not held to a strict liability standard. It has to take reasonable and prompt steps. It can't ignore the situation. And I think that it's a tough standard, but I think it's an appropriately tough standard when it comes to expressive conduct. And so I'm not going to, even at Harvard and Columbia, I would say, if those allegations are factually true, it probably does satisfy the standard, but there's a lot of debate as to whether it's factually true. As to the compatibility of civility and free speech, yes, yes, yes. Even the famous Chicago principles, which are usually thought of as the Chicago free speech principles, and they are, have a statement about the importance of civility and respectful discourse and respect for, mutual respect for our dignity on campus, and that this is something that we should encourage and that we should cultivate and we should nurture. And again, using myself as an example, I set a rule for my classroom, which is a viewpoint neutral rule, but it's not a content neutral rule. It is that you must express your opinion, and you can express any opinion that you want as long as it's supported by appropriate authority, right? It can't just be conclusory or ad hominem, but you must use professionally appropriate language, such as would be appropriate in a court of law or another professional setting. And to me, that would be completely appropriate for us to set as norms of discourse, civil discourse in our classrooms. But it does not translate into self-censoring from an idea that may be perceived or processed as incivil. We have to be very, very careful about that, because we do hear complaints from students, from others saying, oh, but that idea is insulting. Well, it's not expressed in the verbal rhetoric of an insult. And so that does not violate this standard of civility.
Over to this side.
So I was very interested in the study you cited about 248 campuses in terms of discourse, student discourse. And it made me question why there's so much fear about debate and about free speech now and expressing ideas. I went to Brown, and when I was here, people would argue about everything. And individual students didn't feel they were defined by the arguments and the discussions they had. And I wanted to ask, in terms of your research and what you're familiar with as an academic, if you have an explanation for why there's so much fear and why there seems to be so much emotion in terms of engagement now, as opposed to debate and articulation that's analytical, rather than emotional in terms of its framework. And if any of this, do you feel, connects to people's desire for belonging, tribal identity, fear of loneliness, a lot of the dynamics that have happened because of the changes in society recently that we've gone through because of trauma. Because it's just quite shocking to me that people are afraid to engage with each other openly. It seems anti-intellectual to me.
I think you've cited several factors. I mean, it's a very complex phenomenon, as is all human behavior and all social behavior. And you've cited factors that those who have studied and thought about it have cited. In the coddling of the American mind, which I already referred to, other factors that are cited are what they call safetyism and an increasing parenting culture that is very protective of children. There are many positive factors here. The anti-bullying and anti-harassment education that has become very predominant. And I always like to, as an activist, you have to be an optimist, so this is a glass half full. And I really do want to salute the positive impulses that are reflected in what we think is unfortunate censorship of self-censorship of ideas. But I really salute and do not take for granted the deep commitment to equality and dignity and diversity and inclusivity and a concern not to upset or traumatize your fellow students. That's to be commended. And for most of our history, we could not take that for granted. But I think people are, so on the positive side, don't want to hurt somebody else's feelings, even unwittingly. And a somewhat more self-centered concern, don't want to be subject to a viral campaign of shaming and shunning and suffering the demonstrable adverse consequences that are meted out when somebody unwittingly says something that maybe even unfairly is deemed to be insensitive or offensive or discriminatory. And the fear, unfortunately, is rational because surveys show that many people say that they would discriminate against, deny a job to, or urge the firing of, or deny a research grant to, or not hire, I'm using university examples here, not hire as a research assistant somebody who said something that they deem to be offensive. The more recent book in following the coddling of the American mind is called The Canceling of the American Mind. It came out last year. And interestingly enough, that was co-authored by Greg Lukianoff with Ricky Schlott, who is a college-age student. She had gone to NYU, was subject to a cancellation campaign and dropped out and became an independent journalist. And I think Greg very wisely thought, I'm writing about campus, I should co-author it with somebody who's very close to campus. And one of the things that I found encouraging in that book is that the generation that is the most opposed to canceling, and despite all of the wonderful sensitivity, is the generation that is currently undergraduates, because they have been subject to those enormous pressures, and they have seen the harm that it does to their peers and that it does to themselves.
So I think we have time for these two last questions, one from each side. We'll go here first and wrap up over here.
Great. Thanks for your really interesting talk. I'm Mike. I'm an experimental psychologist and faculty in the med school. I'm curious, in practicality, is there oftentimes a tension between the idea of content neutrality and the importance of context? Because I could see it, I'm not a lawyer, but I could see it playing out where unpopular ideas become forbidden allegedly due to the context, kind of as a cover. And then also relatedly, is the context matter, does the speaker have to be aware of the context for it to matter?
Really interesting questions, Mike. So point number one, definitely. I mean, a good example was what happened in Charlottesville when the attempt to withdraw the parade permit that had been granted to Unite the Right was withdrawn on the alleged rationale that there was going to be violence and to protect against the violence. But that's why in the court hearing, our witnesses, including the chief of police, said, no, that's pretextual. We're on top of the situation. We've monitored it, and there's no evidence, nor could any of the city council members who had voted to withdraw the permit were able to come up with any evidence at all. To the contrary, their deliberations contained a lot of statements about how repugnant the ideas of these demonstrators were. So they were trying to embrace the rationale of context, but it was really based on content. And I'm sorry, your second question, I'm obviously getting tired. You're going to have to repeat it.
Does the speaker have to be aware of it?
Oh, aware. Usually, so for example, one of the, yes, I would say almost all, I'm going to say to be careful. To the best of my knowledge, the answer is always yes, as I think of subcategories of speech that the Supreme Court has said satisfies the emergency standard, and some of these will sound very familiar to you. Intentional incitement of imminent violence that is likely to happen imminently. So with respect to, I had a discussion with some students earlier about Donald Trump's speech on January 6th. Should that be punishable intentional incitement? And some of the students were making the very wise point that it was foreseeable. Violence did that people, some of the people who stormed the Capitol said that they were factually incited by Trump to do that. That only satisfies the effect prong. It doesn't prove that Trump, which is necessary to prove, to hold Trump himself culpable, that he intended that result. And same thing with respect to a so-called punishable true threat. In fact, the Supreme Court recently issued a decision on that issue in which it said the speaker has to either intentionally or recklessly, which isn't, it's more than negligence. It's certainly more than consciousness or foreseeability, that knowing that there's a likelihood that this is going to happen, you deliberately choose to proceed with making a statement that's going to put somebody in fear. So thank you for forcing me to think aloud, and the answer is yes.
Please.
Hi, Professor Strossen. Thank you so much. I'm Tali. We met earlier.
Yes.
I'm a sophomore at Brown. I study linguistics. And I'm wondering, so you've talked about how, to fight kind of polarization in these things, it is our job as students to be brave. But from the university standpoint, from a sort of more structuralist standpoint, what should the university do, right? Like I think about the professors that are employed here and the viewpoints that I'm exposed to. There aren't many quote unquote conservative professors. And I feel like, even just like from the point of view of like looking at a syllabus, it's not that the professor necessarily holds all the viewpoints that are espoused in a syllabus, but what are the viewpoints that are being presented to students? So what can the university do to normalize like ideas that like the friction of ideas and differing viewpoints?
That's the really great question. And the impetus for the foundation of an organization called Heterodox Academy, which I think is probably about 7 or 8 years old. Oh, by the way, how can I be here without saluting the very first president of Heterodox Academy, John Tomasi, who of course was a very distinguished member of your faculty and who speaks so lovingly and respectfully of Brown. I know it was painful for him to leave, but he thought that Heterodox Academy was so important that he could take his leave. Anyway, that organization was founded the initial founder was Jonathan Haidt, whom I've referred to before, social psychologist at NYU. He and a number of other social scientists did some research that showed that the credibility and accuracy of research results was undermined by the absence of intellectual pluralism or heterodoxy, that the rigorous cross-examination and investigation and redoubling of the analysis just did not occur when people shared the same ideology. And just from the perspective of the truth-seeking mission of the university, not only in research but also in teaching, as you're alluding to, there is an irreplaceable value in having multiple perspectives, multiple points of view. And of course, you know, each one of us as an individual professor or student has to do our utmost within our human limitations to try to expose ourselves and our students to different points of view. But it becomes much easier to do that if we have colleagues who do have different points of view and are better situated, I think, to point us toward other sources that we should be reading, that we should be exposing our students to. How do you arrive at that result? I'm very, very skeptical. I'll try to remain open-minded, but skeptical about some proposals that have been made for so-called affirmative action for conservatives. I think it would be enough if we would get rid of some of the overt discrimination that many members of faculties are proudly saying they do engage in discrimination, that they will not hire somebody who has a conservative political perspective, or they will not vote to tenure that person, or they will vote against publishing that person's research. If we could just get rid of that discrimination against minority viewpoints, that would be a big step forward. And I think if more and more faculty members understood, even from a selfish perspective, that their own research and scholarship would improve from having colleagues and students with different perspectives, that would be an affirmative incentive to create more intellectual diversity.
Nadine, this has been terrific. You heard in Dean Van Wy's introduction, we're on a bit of a journey this semester to advance our collective understanding of the very complex issues in academic freedom. I want to congratulate you and thank you for enriching our collective understanding this afternoon. Thank you so much for being with us.
Well, it's my great privilege. Thank you so much. Thank you. That was excellent. And I did get questions I hadn't had before, as you can tell. I mean,